is finished and processed. So you'll be able to refer to this presentation after the fact for additional information. So that being said, and knowing that I only have 45 minutes, and I'm going to warn you, I have been known to go over in time and in length in past, but I'm going to try to keep to time because we want to get to all your questions. So we're going to get started. So as I mentioned, our topic today is HTML5 versus native mobile apps. Now, when it comes to mobile, we're often asking people who are in the marketplace about what they're doing with their mobile strategies. And usually the response is pretty much so the same. People say, well, absolutely, we've got a mobile strategy. We've got an app in the App Store, in the app world, or the marketplace, depending on the operating system they're focusing on. And they don't quite get, unless they're a developer, a mobile developer, they don't quite get why now we're looking at different platforms, and to them we're kind of confusing the situation because it's been pretty simple before in the past where you build an app, you put it in the App Store, and that's how you go to market with your strategy. But you know what I'm going to say is that with all of our time in building apps and working within the App Store, we've definitely got some key learnings that we've gained, which is why this whole conversation around HTML5 versus native mobile apps is very relevant to us. In building apps and using the app stores and so on, we realize that, especially with consumer usage and smartphone adoptions, we're realizing that we've got multiple operating systems to consider. And as we get deeper into this presentation, you'll see why multiple operating systems becomes a real pertinent factor when deciding if you're going to go HTML5 versus native mobile apps. So you've got multiple operating systems to consider. You've got folks who are real app fans, so they're using the iOS, whether it be through their iPhone or their iPad devices. In addition to that, Android, Google's methodology of having one operating system to be used across different OEM phones is a great strategy because now we're seeing there's more and more Android phones out there. And then, of course, you've got your loss leaders like BlackBerry and Windows phones. But you've got users who are taking advantage of these different technologies or operating systems. So in building applications to date, or mobile strategies, if you've done so, you realize that if you've got a mobile app, you're realizing you've got to build it a couple of times out to be able to speak to these different operating systems. That can be very costly, and that can also be very time-consuming. So we've got to look at, are there more efficient ways to do this depending on my business makeup and depending on my roadmap and strategy? The other thing that we're finding with our current mobile strategies, which is building an app to speak to one particular operating system, is that it's affecting our time to get to market, our speed to market. And this is where our competition comes into play. If we've got a fabulous concept on how we're going to bring our product to our consumers using mobile as the platform, we're obviously trying to get out there with something net new feature sets to get ahead of the competition or the guy down the street. Having to build an app several times over to speak to different operating systems can also affect your speed to market. And that's what we've actually been seeing currently with our clients and trying to get them out there when they want to build different apps to speak to different operating systems. The other thing that is affecting us and things that we've learned so far to date with the way we've been going at mobile is our consumer and user habits is affecting us in the sense that more and more people are finding use of different smartphone operating systems. More and more people are using mobile as a way to consume information and for shopping. No longer is it okay for us to provide people with WAP-enabled versions of our websites. People are looking for functionality that's going to be tactile and intuitive and working with their mobile phones. So through our experience to date in dealing with mobile strategies, we've realized that we've got a lot of work to do to make it more intuitive for our users. One of the good things to say, though, is that we do have options. And I think, in working with technology, this is something you would expect. You would expect at this point, regardless of the technology, as that we grow and as it evolves, we're going to have options as marketers and business leaders in terms of how we can go to market with our mobile products with our customers and more intuitive fashions. And you do have options. And your options right now, and the options that are most debated right now, are whether you build your mobile application, your mobile strategy using HTML5 versus native mobile apps. And it's a great debate. But what I want to do first before we get into the debatable topics is I want to do a bit of a background and explain the differences between HTML5 and native mobile apps. And now if you're already a mobile developer on this call, or if you're a business manager and you've already got a well fine-tuned and into mobile strategy in place, I apologize for taking you back a bit, but I want to make sure as we move forward that we are doing this and we're all on the same page. So HTML5 simply is a mobile web application. So instead of creating an application that speaks specifically to one operating system, whether that be Android or BlackBerry or iOS for Apple devices, we're building a web application that renders specifically for mobile, okay? That's all HTML5 is. A lot of people will praise HTML5 because it's highly scalable. Knowing that all of our smartphones have browsers within them, so we know that all of our smartphones can access the web. Meaning technically, if I build this mobile web application, every single smartphone that's got browser capabilities should be able to access this particular application. So one of the things and one of HTML5's great selling features is that it's highly scalable across multiple platforms, okay? And as we get deeper into the presentation here today, we're going to talk about the languages involved to program within HTML5. And one of the things that you will see is that it's really, really simple. So for most folks, when looking at this, they see HTML5 as a very viable option because of reasons. We'll even, as we go on here later on today, we'll even look at some of the major heavy players in the marketplace, the folks who are using HTML5, and you may be surprised to see that folks of that scale are using HTML5. But it does give credit to HTML5 being a viable option. Native mobile apps, probably the term or the mobile strategy that you're most familiar with. And that's really simple. You know, you've got a smartphone, it provides a store where you go on to get applications. All of the applications that you download to your device are specific to your device. So if I've got an application for Tumblr and I'm going on to the App Store to get it, I know that Tumblr has built their application so it works specifically with my iPhone, okay? Native mobile apps are all syndicated through stores and sometimes also through the website, but mostly through stores. And I think if you were to ask anybody what form of mobile program or mobile environment that they're most familiar with when it comes to applications, they would tell you native mobile apps, okay? So really the basic difference between the two, HTML5 is a mobile web application. So if your phone can access a browser, has browser capabilities, you're able then to access my mobile web application using HTML5. Native mobile apps, it's specific to an operating system. So that's basically the differences between the two. Now, depending on who you talk to in the circles of mobile and publishing mobile content, you're going to have people who will side on both sides of the fence, really. There are great selling points and selling features to both HTML5 and native mobile apps, but really, one of the things that we do later on, really the solution that you go with is really dependent on you. There's no clear-cut answer to say, hey, you should be using this particular platform or be building in this particular environment for your mobile strategy. It really is dependent on your business types. And there are a list of questions and things that you're going to want to ask yourself, and we'll go through that later. But there are a list of questions and things you're going to want to ask yourself to determine which mode of development for mobile makes the most sense for your business. What we have done, though, today to help you in making that decision is we've got a couple of I guess, headers or content areas, and we're going to go through and compare the differences between a mobile web app, so HTML5, versus a native app. And hopefully these 7 headings that we have will help you to kind of build a greater picture in how these 7 things can implicate what your mobile strategy will work best with. Okay, so let's get started in looking at how they stack up, mobile web apps versus native apps. So when we take a look at cross-platform compatibility, and what I mean by that is allowing your application to speak to multiple operating systems. As I mentioned before, we all know there are 4 big ones already. You know, you've got your iOS for your Apple devices, Android for your Android devices, BlackBerry, and Windows Phone. So for me as a publisher, if I'm someone who's got content that I want to distribute in a mobile fashion, I'm going to want to take a look at how I can get this content delivered to as many users as possible, or as many people who want to consume my data as possible. And so I want to look at how well I can scale my application. With the mobile web app, as I mentioned before, you technically build it once, and once that smartphone has got browser capabilities, that user can access my mobile web app. In some cases, depending on the functionality that you want your mobile web app to include, you may have to do some additional tweaking to get it to work for some of the other operating systems, but 9 times out of 10, if you build it once as a mobile web app, you can be certain that if someone has a smartphone with browser capabilities, they're going to be able to access your application. When it comes to cross-platform compatibility in native applications, you cannot do that. You cannot build it once and hope that, well, you've already done all this work for the iOS, it's going to work for Android. That's not the case. What I will say, of course, is that, you know, if you build it once for iOS, you would have had to have done all of your requirements, all of your strategies in terms of how the user will access the information and what you want the user to do with the information. And that's a good chunk of data that you'll have to work through. And that can remain the same for all of your operating systems. But when you hand it over to your developer and say, great, now build this, so we're on an on an iPhone, sorry, or on an Android device, that's where the differences come into play. As I mentioned, I do have a table later on when we talk about resources and the types of resources you would have to make sure you have access to build within these particular operating system environments. You'll see how the languages differ greatly depending on which operating system you're going to have to build your app in. So it's not as simple as saying, I've built once, so now I can just take what I've built and copy it over to other operating systems, or in most cases, like many of our clients are saying, it's not as simple as saying I built it once using mobile developer X, that same developer can build it over in another operating system. A lot of times you're going to find that you need people with different skill sets. So that's cross-platform compatibility. The next thing I want to talk about is syndication. And for all of us on this call, syndication should be very important. Syndication, in the sense that we're using it here, is, so I've built this particular app to distribute my content to my users. How now can I make sure that they know it's available? And syndication is one area where a lot of times your native apps win out in this section. With the mobile web app or building through HTML5, most times you do not have a store that you can take advantage of. There is a caveat to that, and we'll speak to it later on, but most times you don't have the store that you can take advantage of. So you're left then with using your own website, your own content website, to allow people to realize you've got a mobile web app that they can use. It could be that someone is accessing your website from their smartphone, and you detect that they're coming to your site from their smartphone, and you then show them the option of the mobile web app. It could be that. It could be that we've got a lot of clients who also email the links to their mobile web app through their email marketing services. But all in all, really, there is only one source to get the word out in terms of syndicating that you've got an app, which is you and your properties. Whereas with the native app, and people a lot of times take this for granted, but it really is powerful. With the native app, having that store that users can access to gather your information on your mobile app is actually quite powerful. So people can access your content in two ways. The one obvious way is that they go into their app store and they search for your name, your business name, and look to see if you've got an application there. The other way that we, as publishers of content, can take advantage of an app store is that a lot of times users search for categories, not necessarily names of businesses. And if you've indexed your content well, if indexed and labeled your application well, then there's a good chance, and as I'm searching for directories, if I'm searching for group buying or coupons, that you can also show up in that search. So you're taking advantage of my passive search. Now you're taking advantage of the fact that you may gain a new customer doing syndication through the App Store. And with Apple, really I will say with Apple, and their whole strategy when they first came out with their app store and saying there's an app for that, they really played up the syndication portion of how that really helps with the native applications. So here when it comes to syndication and trying to get the word out, if you're not a well-known brand, the native app definitely benefits from having an app store or a store to take advantage of. Next, let's talk about functionality, which to me is a big thing, obviously. If I'm going to market as a part of my mobile strategy and wanting to allow users to access my content, I want to make sure that, I've built some use cases. So I've got a customer, they come and they access my content, and I expect them to want to be able to do these three things. These are the three big things that I expect them to do with my content. So that's your functionality. What I will say is that for the most part, everything that you want someone to do in terms of functionality with your native app can happen with your HTML5 application. It definitely can. There are some cases where there are some phone features that your mobile web app will not be able to access. But for the most part, you can access everything. And I'm going to make the argument here, and some people may disagree, but I make the argument oftentimes when talking to clients, and whether it be that they want to build a website, whether it be they want to build a mobile strategy, I always tell them to focus on the core functionality versus the bells and whistles. The bells and whistles will come, but it's the core functionality that's going to allow clients to come back to your property. It's the core functionality that's going to allow clients or encourage your clients to recommend your application. So it's definitely, working on or focusing on the core functionality, not necessarily the bells and whistles. So I say that about mobile web apps. So HTML5, you can definitely get most of the functionality one can get with a native app. When it comes to native apps now, I got to be honest and say there are certain phone features that a native app can take advantage of. Because again, with a native app, you're building something that's supposed to work specifically with that operating system, which means now with my application, I may want you as my customer to take advantage of the camera or the GPS features of your phone. That's not as easy to do with mobile web apps because we're building a generic tool. But you know what? Later on, as we get into the webinar even further, we've got examples of really big players who are using HTML5 because of the type of content they're syndicating. So it really just depends on the content you want to syndicate. Do you need to access things like the camera or the GPS on the phone? Or if you're publishing news or publishing news content and blog content, is it fine or is it okay for you to use mobile web app or HTML5 and deliver the content that way, not depending on the functionality within that particular phone or operating system? So again, that's a key thing to think about when it comes to functionality. User interface, and this one is for all of the designers that are on the call and people who are really concerned with aesthetics. Later on, when we talk about some of the players who are using HTML5 versus native, we do some side-by-side comparisons. So you can see what it looks like when you're using a native mobile app versus the mobile web app. So you can see, and when I show you that, you'll see that, again, the functionality is the same. There's a lot of the same feature sets when you look at them, a lot of the same design sets. But I will tell you that, and I'm not going to lie, using a native app and speaking to the operating system specifically allows for some enhanced design interface features. So one of the things that you'll see when we do the side-by-side comparison, you'll see that the mobile web app is very tactile. It's intuitive. I can use it. But yes, the native apps oftentimes do look a little sleeker and a little cleaner in most cases. Next, let's talk about monetization, which I think is probably ahead of syndication, but as important as syndication for folks who are on this phone. And monetization will mean different things to you depending on your mobile strategy. So with mobile web apps, the ways that we see that you're able to take what you're doing with mobile web and how many users are accessing your mobile web app and monetize that, you've got two ways technically to do that. One is, because it's a mobile web entity, it falls into your web traffic in senses. So as you monetize your traffic for your web properties, you can include your mobile web traffic in that as well. So when you're presenting to potential advertisers and trying to convert them to advertise with you or become a vested advertiser with you, you can also use the traffic gained from your mobile web app usage through your data analytics that you get for your websites. So that's one way you can do it. The second way that you can take a look at monetization in mobile web apps is through your return on investment, and I'll explain that a little bit more after I go through the native app side. With native apps, I mean, it's pretty basic, right? We all know that your apps can be sold if you wanted to in the stores, in the app stores. So you can charge a fee per download. And that may or may not make or break your strategy. For some folks, if I'm a gamer and I build games, this would probably make a lot of sense to me. I want you to buy my game each time when you download it from the App Store. So a fee per download makes sense for me if I'm a gamer or I'm building games. However, if I'm publishing content and I want to distribute content because I want to build a larger audience, charging per download may not be so important to me. So it really is about your strategy. But as we talk about monetization, it's not enough just to look at the top end, to look at how much money I'm going to make immediately from someone using my application. It's also important to take a look at your investment to build these applications. So again, unless you're a gamer and understanding that that fee per download is what's going to make or break you, you're going to want to take a look at this. As we talked about before, in order for me to build an application to work with a specific smartphone, I've got to make sure I build the application to uniquely match and speak to that operating system. So if I'm concerned with iOS for Apple devices, Android, BlackBerry, and Windows phones, that means I need to build this application 4 times over. What will that cost me versus what I can make in terms of utilizing the monetization strategies in those stores? So these are some questions you want to ask yourself when you're looking at monetization. It's not as cut and dry as what I can make up at the front end, at the top end, when someone accesses the application. Okay? Move on to the next one here. Development resources. And this is a really big one. Before diving deep into the debate about mobile web apps and native apps, I never once took the time to take a look at the different languages folks have to use in order to be able to program an app to speak to a specific operating system. I mean, I knew there was a disconnect. I will tell you probably the beginning of 2011, I had a lot of people call me saying, hey, you know, Bev, we've got our iPhone app, but we need an Android app, and I need to find a developer. They were unable to go to the person that built their application using the iOS language or environment to build the Android environment. So it was a big thing trying to find Android developers. And I will say this, even with Android itself, because you've got so many different OEMs, there are some Android developers that will tell you what they develop and think is going to work well with all Android phones. They find that there's one particular phone from a specific OEM that's still using the Android software operating system that doesn't render all of their feature sets the same. So even with an Android, you may come up against some discrepancies depending on the type of phone that someone's using. But as you can see from this table over here on the right-hand side under native apps, the languages required to build these applications to speak to the operating systems, they vary quite a bit. So you know now it's going to be very difficult for you to find one mobile developer who can do it all for you. Now you're noticing you're going to have to manage multiple resources to build these things out. If you take a look on the left-hand side here with mobile web apps, you'll see that the requirements needed in order for someone to develop in this particular environment are pretty simple. If you can build a website, you're halfway there because you understand the language that's used to develop a mobile web app, which is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And I think if you've got any developers on your team and you ask them what languages they're most familiar with, this should by far be the greatest one. So from what we can see in terms of development resources, there are less resources for development required with your mobile web app than there is with your native app. And again, we're going to have the recording syndicated, so in case you want to see more about the languages required, you'll be able to see that after the folks at ICMA post this recording on their website. The last kind of content heading that I want to talk about is rules and regulations. And what I mean by this is what it is that you have to do in order to bring your mobile web app to market, or your application to market. With mobile web apps, we all know that the only thing holding us back to bring it to market is ourselves, making sure we've thought about, our strategies, functionality, use cases, and so on, and got a great developer, great design. Once we've finished all of that stuff and we've got our strategy in play, we can now go out to the world and say, ta-da, eureka, here's the application. What I will say about rules and regulations, though, with mobile web apps, to be fair, the debate right now, and folks who side against using HTML5 oftentimes speak to the security concerns of HTML5. And out of the box, in its most rudimentary senses, yes, that is a valid point. Because the language that we're using is basically HTML, there's the risk and the concern that some people have that a savvy developer, HTML developer, could gain access and could tweak with the application. However, an argument to that, what I will say is, and I'll show you later on, we've got some very big players who have overcome all of that. So your warning here is that if you choose to go HTML5, you want to make sure that security is at the forefront, looking at how you can most make this application most secure. So that's important to do. With native apps, though, we've got a ton of rules and regulations to get something approved and bring it to market for your customers when using app stores. One example I'm going to use, and this is something a lot of you probably already know if you have already submitted any applications to the App Store and so on. Maybe your first time, you may have been declined or rejected for various reasons. So this is something that you do know. I think a lot of people go through this. But specifically, I want to use the example of the Financial Times. So the Financial Times, I want to say in July or August, pulled all of their apps from the App Store. And they pulled their apps from the App Store because Apple and the Financial Times couldn't come eye to eye, or couldn't see eye to eye on the subscription model, on the in-app subscription model. What the App Store wants you to do, if you've got a business model that requires people to subscribe and pay for subscriptions, the App Store wants you to do in-application subscriptions. This way, allowing them to monitor how many of them you get, and allowing them to charge you 30% bounty on each of those in-app subscriptions. The Financial Times, unlike the Wall Street Journal, decided that instead of changing the rules, they were going to pull all of their applications, all of their apps out of the iStore. So the Financial Times US, you'll go on there and you'll see they've got no applications in the App Store at all, and this is primarily why. Now, when you talk to folks at the Financial Times, they will tell you that it wasn't having to pay Apple that 30% bounty on the in-app subscriptions that caused them to pull out. What caused them to pull out, they said, was the fact that when someone subscribes to Financial Times, there's some key personal profile data that the Financial Times is able to collect. You know, your name, age, the industry you work in, email address, that type of thing. Their concern for the Financial Times team was that they were going to lose access to that information, which is very key to their strategy. That's how they market to people in order to get them to renew again, or that's how they market to people when doing partnership email blasts with some of their clients. So that's why they pulled out. But the whole point here is that regardless of the size of the publisher and regardless of how many users that publisher's application has, when it comes to rules and regulations in some of these stores, they're unwilling to bend. And so we all succumb to these. So sometimes it can be a little daunting to get our applications approved and processed and out to market using these app stores. So that was just a few of the headers that for us, you know, in trying to determine the differences and the comparisons between mobile web apps versus native apps. Those are some of the headers and things that we look at when trying to figure out what's the best of the two. But with that being said, in the debate and whenever we had a chance to talk about it, people do ask us, is there a best of both worlds solution? Is there a way that I can use both? And actually, there is a way that you can use both. There is a hybrid methodology, and for a lot of people right now, at this early stage of HTML or mobile web apps, at this early stage of it, this hybrid methodology is what a lot of people are using. And from our perspective, we feel there are two ways you can kind of use this hybrid methodology. The first one applies to your basic mobile strategy. So one of the things that we talk about later on is we say, you know, when you're making decisions on which route you're going to take, make sure it's based on data. And all of you should have web analytics that you can take advantage of. And you can take a look at what mobile operating system is being used the most by your consumer base to access your content. So for me, it may be that my consumer base is using the iOS, their iPhones and iPads by far. So it may be that I then create an application on the iOS environment specifically for those particular devices. And for everybody else, I build a mobile web app. So therefore, I'm covering off all smartphones, all of my consumer base, but I'm making sure the tier of consumers who interact with me the most using mobile applications also have the ability to use a native mobile app. So that's one way of doing a hybrid. The other way of doing a hybrid, and we've seen this, is that people will build a native app, but it's got some HTML5 components within it. And where people use this often is if your application or your use cases have one of your customers doing some sort of e-commerce or spend or purchase type activity using their mobile phone. And a lot of people do that because the rules around e-commerce in an app are very, very difficult. And a lot of times when apps are rejected from stores, it's around that whole e-commerce and the purchasing piece and it not being secure enough for Apple, for example. So what a lot of people do is they'll let you do most of the functionality using the native app and it's speaking directly to your operating system, but as soon as you press or indicate that you want to buy something, they now bring in the HTML5 components of their web property because they know that's secure. They know their web stores have been in place for quite some time and that's above board and secure. So they take you out and you go into their HTML5 components to do purchases. And that's how we've seen people build native apps that kind of wrap in some HTML5 components within it. And in that case, again, you've got the best of both worlds. You could take advantage of the store, but you're taking the more difficult pieces of your application and use case activities and doing that in your web environment. So that's another way of doing the hybrid. Now, we can't finish this without talking about how the big players see it. What are they saying about this particular argument around HTML5 and native mobile apps? Well, what we'll say is that, the obvious. A lot of the players, such as the Apples and the Googles of the world, they've invested a lot of money in the native mobile apps and around this infrastructure. They have tested, tweaked, retweaked, spruced up, relaunched monetization strategies over and over and over again. They're recognizing that they're making a fair amount of money from these stores that they've created for these native apps. They've been created tools for developers not only to help them in building applications, but to also help them in getting their applications approved quickly and seamlessly and effectively. So in essence, then, what they've done is they've built this whole ecosystem around apps and stores for natives. But with all that being said, though, the same big players that we're talking about have also invested, maybe without all of us knowing outright, but they've also invested a lot of money and effort of late into HTML5. And this is really powerful, because what that means is not only are the industry pundits right when they say they strongly believe HTML5 will be the future of mobile web, or mobile apps, but it's also indicating that even those who are vested in native apps, such as your Apples of the world and the Googles of the world, also recognize that HTML5 is something not to be ignored when it comes to mobile, hence their investments at this point. For them, it makes sense that they invest at this point and build strategies, because they're going to want to make sure they can somehow monetize the HTML5 app world, hence their investments. When I take a look at Google, their whole acknowledgement of HTML5 is very inherent. If any of you use Chrome, Chrome is technically Google's HTML5 experiment. And Chrome is actually my favorite browser, but that was all built around using HTML5 and looking at how far they can extend HTML5. Google has also invested in a lot of tools to help people port applications to HTML5. So again, you can see that they're recognizing that HTML5 has a place in our future when it comes to mobile. If any of you listen to the keynotes from Facebook, if you look at the keynotes that they did in December of 2010 and also the beginning of 2011, they spoke a lot about HTML5 being their focus throughout 2011. And that's something that we saw as they changed a lot of the things around their Facebook pages, and a lot of the tools that they developed and rolled out this year were all centered around HTML5. So even the big players are getting it. And I want to talk a bit about Apple. And Apple would be the one that I think out of all of them that we would least expect to recognize HTML5. But right on the Apple site, there's access for you to get to a point where you can see all of the web apps available for iOS. So, and on that site too, they claim that they've got over 5,000 mobile apps, and the list is growing. One of the ones that you'll see here that's on this page is the one for Facebook, just over here towards the right. And a lot of people will argue, maybe not so much now since they've made some recent changes with the new platform, but a lot of people will argue that for the longest time, the Facebook mobile app was much better than the native app that you were offered. So this just goes to show that a lot of the big players are investing in HTML5. A lot of the big players are recognizing that it's going to be a big part of our future. So definitely something not to be ignored. Now I want to take a look at some practical side-by-sides. This here that I'm showing you is a screenshot of YouTube's mobile web app. As you can see, I can access all of my content fairly easily here, either this way or looking at tiles over here to the right-hand side. And when I take a look at YouTube, this is the type of, remember I said before, it really depends on your business and what it is that you want people to do with your content using their mobile phones. This is a good example. If you take a look at the use case of when someone is going to pull up their smartphone and access YouTube, it's probably, in a lot of cases, to solve an argument or to end an argument, or someone says, oh my gosh, have you seen this viral video? I think it's called 123 ABC. You pull out your phone and you simply search for it. As you can see here, it's very easy for me to do that. There's great search icons and search fields available, so I can search and get my content very quickly. So for YouTube, you know, using this mobile app, gives it everything it needs to give for their users to be able to access the content. Next example I have here is Tumblr. Tumblr is a blog site. It's a hosted, nested blog site. So it allows me to go in and create a Tumblr page, and I could blog about whatever topic I want to. But this is a view of Tumblr's mobile web app version, and they have both. Tumblr has both a mobile web app and a native app. So as you can see here, you log in, you can see recent posts. You've got a drop down that allows you to go deeper into the application. And I'm just going to do a side-by-side here for you, showing you Tumblr's native mobile app, which is on the right-hand side, versus the mobile web app built in HTML5. So on the left-hand side, again, you've got the HTML5 version. On the right-hand side, you've got the native app. Now, let's point out some of the differences. As you can see here, the navigation on the mobile app is based on that drop-down that's up at the top of the screen there, right beside the Tumblr logo, whereas the navigation in the native app is at the bottom. So you remember earlier on I was talking about, from a functionality perspective, both can do the same for the most part. But from a design perspective, you may find a cleaner look with the native app. And that's what you're seeing. So with the native app on the right-hand side, the navigation being nested here at the bottom nav in black does look pretty sleek and pretty nice, whereas the mobile web app is using a bit of an older form of navigation, which is the drop-down. But for me, again, as a user, I know that if I come here, I can do the same type of activity regardless of, using a mobile web app or a native app. Now let's take a look at LinkedIn. LinkedIn also provides both. LinkedIn will provide you with the HTML5 version and also a native app. On the left-hand side of the screen is the HTML5 version of the LinkedIn application. On the right-hand side is the native app version of LinkedIn. Now, one thing again I'm going to call out is, from a functionality perspective, I'm able to do everything I need to do on both. I will admit the native app over on the right-hand side does have that lovely LinkedIn Today banner, but when I'm going on to LinkedIn, my core function, when I'm taking a look at the use case, my core function is to look at what's happening in my network. What are my network players talking about today? And I can definitely do that when looking at the mobile app, the HTML5 app. In order for me to get into LinkedIn Today and that type of thing, I may have to click around a little more on the HTML5 version, but I know the core activity that I will want to do with LinkedIn, I can do right off the bat as soon as I get there on the first screen using the mobile web app. Now the next one I want to talk about is Netflix, and for those of you who know me, you probably know that I'm probably Netflix's biggest fan. This is how I spend most of my Friday nights. Nonetheless, with Netflix, if you are actually looking at, do I build everything out using HTML5 or do I stick to this native approach? I strongly encourage you to do a lot of research on Netflix. Netflix does everything using HTML5, and they're working on some other environments as well, but not native environments. They're not going the native route. They're all HTML5. Netflix will tell anybody who's willing to listen why and how they went about with their particular strategy. If you take a look at a property like Netflix with millions of users, streaming lots of content, hosting lots of content. Again, as we talked about security issues, that some people may claim HTML5 has a ton of security issues, what we're seeing here with Netflix is that they're able to overcome it and host such a robust tool set on HTML5. I've got a bit of a quote here on the right-hand side from Netflix's VP of Personalization, and I won't read the entire quote, but I will paraphrase. He speaks to, within this quote, why they chose to go HTML5. And this is an important point. He said that Netflix is constantly making updates to their applications, making updates to their systems and the way it moves and navigation and functionality. Their concern was that they wanted to make sure that they were able to release these updates as quickly as possible to their users, regardless of the platform that they were using to consume their data. And that's very big. So for them, it was the user experience, and that's why they went HTML5. They felt they were able to syndicate the changes to HTML5 a lot easier. So remember before I was saying it really is dependent on you to determine, which mode of development makes sense for your business. Well, let's talk about that. So there are a list of questions and things that you're going to want to ask yourself. Can everybody hear me okay? If you can, just type yes into that search box. I do see someone saying that they can't hear and that the sound went off. Okay, perfect. So it sounds like you can hear me. Perfect, perfect. I like how you guys are still engaged and interacting with me. I'm getting a lot of yeses. That's lovely. Okay. Okay. So let's go. So let's talk about those things that you need to ask yourself when you're deciding what route you want to take. I will tell you that at this stage of the HTML5 game, hybrid solutions make a lot of sense for folks, especially if you've got a purchase element in your mobile strategy. You want your customers to buy something or subscribe using cards or whatever the case may be. Hybrid solutions are something to take a look at, where you're blending the best of both worlds, where you've built natively into an operating system, but you're pulling out certain aspects of the functionality and using your mobile web solution for that. But when trying to decide what you're going to build in, you really got to take a look at your target demographic, what they're asking you for, what operating systems are they using. We've got one particular client who's got an even split between iOS, Android, and BlackBerry is a couple of points below them. They're not in North America, in case you're wondering, based on those stats. Because in North America, BlackBerry would be tons below them. But nonetheless, so for them, it was very difficult for us to say, well, let's build natively and get to market at the time frame that they wanted us to get to market. For us, we had to build an HTML5 application, allowing them to address their target demographic. Their customers were telling us they're using all of these different operating systems to access their content, which means then for us, in order for us to do this effectively, we've got to be able to build something quick, robust, and get it to market. So you want to take a look at your target demographic. What are they telling you? What are the operating systems and the numbers of them telling you? Then you want to take a look at your engagement strategies. And by this, I really mean sitting down with your team and mapping out your use cases. You've got content to share. How do you expect a customer to use this content? What are they going to do when they get to your platform? Build out those use cases, because that will tell you if you can afford to do the mobile web app or the HTML5 version, which is one version syndicated to all, or it will also tell you if there are feature sets within specific phones that you want to take advantage of, and therefore the question is now raised of, will an HTML5 generic version of this app cover everything that we want to cover, or do we need to go direct operating system methodology? The other thing you want to take a look at is you want to consider the skill set and the budgets. As we talked about before, it's not as though you can take one developer and say, listen, I want you to build across these 4 platforms. The languages and the environments are very different. Even amongst Android itself, sometimes you can find some slippage in functionality between the different Android phones. And that's going to be costly and time consuming. So take a look at your budget and the speed to market desires. When you take a look at budget and speed to market desires, you also want to take into consideration not just your first release, but as publishers and people sharing content with information to share, we should be looking at our data and we should be improving the application. So the same effort that you had to go through to build that native app 4 times over when you first released it, as you do an upgrade to the system, you're going to have to do that upgrade 4 times over again, because you're speaking to 4 different operating systems. So think about speed to market and budget on the long haul, holistically, not just when you first launch, but as you do upgrades and releases to the application. What I'll also say, though, is as you're sitting down and you're talking about the pros and cons, as we can see, you've got some of the big players investing in HTML5, which means it shouldn't be ignored. Not only are the mobile pundits in the industry saying, we really do believe that HTML5 is going to be the future, where mobile is going, but you've got the heavy players where you wouldn't have thought it, but they're also investing in mobile, HTML5, sorry, even though they've invested so much money in their native app stores. This is the last content slide that I have before we do another quick recap. And this just simply shows that, it's data that shows what people are willing to do using their browser on their smartphone. So not using an application, but using their browser on their smartphone and what they're willing to spend money with. So if I take a look at how engaged folks are with just even using the browser on their smartphone and spending money using the browser on their smartphone, I should be able to make a correlation that if this is the case, then maybe building out an HTML5 will just be fine. Because these folks have access to do things using native applications, but are choosing to do them using the browser on their phone. So there's a correlation that could be here, depending on the type of business that you're in. So quick recap, obviously with competition and consumer behaviors, it's forcing us to take a look at our mobile strategy, and we need to sit down and kind of take a look at that. We definitely do have options. You know, do we go the native route or the HTML5 route? There's definite options, and there are things, you know, as technology changes and as user behaviors change and how they want to consume data or how they want to engage with a brand, that changes very quickly now too. Do we need to look at getting to market a lot faster? You know, the constraints that we had before in trying to get to market using native mobile apps are no longer really there if we take a look deeply at HTML5. That may help you get to market faster. But ultimately, no one can give you the answer in terms of what you need to do. The answer for you and your business has to come from you sitting down and taking a look at those list of questions that we talked about, your target demographic, how do you want people to engage with you, what does your use cases say that you're going to do once they get to your application, how much money do you have to spend, what's your revenue model, and do you have any resources to build these things for you? You ask yourself those questions, you're guaranteed to come up with a better solution or a honed-in solution for how you're going to build out your mobile solution moving forward. And don't forget, you also want to take a look at hybrid solutions. There is a way for you to take the best of both worlds and go to market using that. But of course, as usual, as we say all the time, make decisions with data in mind. So in closing, your mobile solution isn't black and white. You definitely have options, depending on which route you want to take. Okay, as I mentioned, I wanted to go to 45 minutes, but I just had so much to share. But we do have about 5 minutes to address questions, and it looks like you've got a couple of questions here. One question was, can you wrap an HTML5 app, iOS wrapper for the App Store? And there are some yes and no. There are some rules around that in terms of how much HTML5 versus native language is within your particular app. But there is a way for you to get the best of both worlds. As I mentioned before, we have clients where we've built things that are specific to the operating system, but certain parts of the user functionality we've pulled out and use a H5 solution for that because we're relying on the web solution for that. And specifically where we find that is when we've got an e-commerce portion of the functionality that's required. One of the biggest concerns for security with the stores is when they get apps that have a purchase feature to them, they really sit down and scrutinize that purchase feature. And rightfully so, they want to make sure that their customers are also protected, but they really do scrutinize that purchasing feature. So that gets a little tricky when you're trying to build all of that functionality within the native app. It's a lot easier for us to kind of pull that stuff out and go HTML5 for that. will you be showing as a sample class? No. So someone has asked, will you be showing us a sample of a classified HTML5 app that uses camera and GPS? No, we didn't have an example of that in the presentation, but I can connect with the folks over at ICMA, with Heather, to see if examples like that are required. We can pull that stuff out. It's hard to get specific in terms of examples when you've got people coming from different backgrounds, directory, news, and classifieds on the call. So we tried to keep big picture to give you the pros and cons of both mobile strategies. Is there a way to upload images via HTML5 app? Yes, there is. There definitely is. It's not just something that can be done natively. That can be built into your HTML5 app. Think of HTML5 in mobile web apps and functionality. If that functionality could exist on your website, it could exist on your HTML5 app. So the fact of uploading photos is definitely a possibility. And I think we've answered all of our questions so far. We do have 2 additional minutes. If you've got a question, you've got 2 minutes to get it in. If not, what I will say is we're going to send the recording of this call over to the folks at ICMA, and they will post it on their website. And I'm sure I send out a link so you know where you can access the presentation. No additional questions at this moment. I think we're done. Well, I want to thank you guys very much for staying on for the full hour and listening to me ramble on. I'm hoping that it was useful and you got some great content. And if you've got questions, my information is here at the bottom of this slide, so you can also email me. Or if you've got future questions, you can also send them to the folks at ICMA, and we're in contact. And they'll let me know what other questions you have and if there's further detail or information that you require. So thanks so much for joining us today. Take care.